this morning with Dr. Billy. And so on behalf of the Diversity Executive Leadership Academy Advisory Board, we welcome you to our second live interview session on attack on diversity training. As you know, the recent executive orders have left many diversity and inclusion professionals in a state of concern as we scramble to both review and resubmit vital diversity training. So the DELA Advisory Board wanted to present an opportunity for like-minded professionals like you to both address these and other issues concerning the current controversy, as well as use this opportunity to talk about diversity and training as a tool for achieving inclusion and sharing best practices for creating an equitable and belonging environment. So we're presenting 3 sessions today, and we have phenomenal speakers within the D&I space with us today. This is the second session that will last about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up at the end for questions and comments. And so we ask that you put those in the chat feature of the Zoom session. And then we also want to let you know that this session is being recorded. So get your face right and get ready. So with that in mind, we'll get started. So our second interview session is with Mr. Howard Ross, and Howard J. Ross has been a considerable impact on diversity training practices. His unconscious bias publications and training programs started a global movement. The result is that best practices is no longer focusing solely on the awareness and sensitivity training. Howard is a lifelong social justice advocate, a builder of innovations in the field of diversity and inclusion, and a unifier of people, organization, and causes. He is the founder of Cook Ross Incorporated and an advisor to major global educational, corporate, philanthropic, and governmental organizations. Through his unique combination of personal and system-focused approach, Howard is an advocate for high-performing organizational cultures that advocate people, performance, and profits. His interviewer today is Mr. Juan Meraz, PhD and certified diversity professional, a DELA Advisory Board member, and currently serves as a faculty and staff caucus member at the Missouri State University. And with that, we'll get started. And Juan, take it away.
All right, welcome everybody. Glad to have you with us. I want to talk fast, so you're gonna have to listen even faster. But I'll let Howard kind of give a brief overview of his quick experience, and then we'll dive right into the questions, because it's always good to know everybody's background, because sometimes we don't encapsulate it all. So I'll turn it over to Howard real quickly, and then we'll dive into the questions.
Thanks so much, Juan. Thanks, everybody. It's good to be with you. Crazy times we're living in. I hope everybody's staying safe and well, and your families are all well. Yeah, it's been quite a journey. I started doing this work professionally 35 years ago. As I was just saying before we got on, you know, my journey with diversity and inclusion started when I was a teenager, when I got involved in civil rights, and then I got professionally spent the first 12 years out of college as a teacher and a school administrator before I went into doing organizational development work. And the two things came together in the mid 80s when the diversity movement in corporations really started, and it became clear that, you know, this was a profession. I never thought. I always thought when we started way back then that it would be sort of taking a vow of poverty to do the work, but who knew that it would turn into the global movement that it's become. My background, which is important in my family background, is that I'm Jewish. My family comes from Eastern Europe, and we had enormous family loss during the Holocaust. And I think that's significant just because I think it's at the heart of why I do this work. All 3 of my sisters and I, it sort of became our family business. My oldest sister became one of our nation's leading immigration lawyers until she retired about 2 years ago. My younger sister was Marian Wright Edelman's fundraiser to Children's Defense Fund for 15 years before she went into doing work with other social justice organizations. And I got involved in this, as I said, and I think the first diversity training I ever got paid for was in 1985. So it's a long time ago. And it's evolved over time. And, you know, as you said, your words were very kind. I started to get interested in unconscious bias in the 90s, primarily because I found that the methods that we were using, you know, a lot of the shame and blame kind of work that we were doing, where we would beat people with the stick until they saw the error of their ways. Some of you are old enough to remember that. Just weren't working. You know, I mean, it was fine for people who were already sort of going along with it, but what I noticed was that it was driving other people more deeply into resistance and into hiding. And so And I was also curious, like how it was that people who I would meet who were clearly good and decent people could have some of the ideas that they did. And so I sort of stumbled into the unconscious bias work, and first looking at some of the academic research, because as some of you know, at that time, which was maybe the mid 90s, almost none of this work was outside of the academy. I mean, almost all of it was in the academy. And the benefit of being a consultant as opposed to an academic is that you can learn something today and teach it tomorrow. You don't have to go through peer review studies and things like that. So I'd read something and then I'd mention it the next day, and all of a sudden people were responding like, wait, what was that? And you know, the same people who were resisting were saying, we need more. And so I've been very fortunate. You know, it's given me an opportunity to travel all around the world. And, you know, I've worked in 47 of the 50 states and 45 other countries. And I did sell Cook Ross in 2018 to our partner. And then my wife, Leslie Trout, who's also been my business partner, and I decided we just wanted to have a little bit more flexibility at this stage of our lives. I said at the time I was rewiring and not retiring. So I still do projects. We have a new company called Udarta, which is the Hindu word for generosity and compassion. And we still do work on certain projects, and probably about half of my work now is pro bono or community oriented. So that's as quick as I can do for 70 years.
Well, that's a great snapshot and gives us a good insight into the background and the knowledge and skills that you have. And you know, at our point in time right now, we're at an interesting point in our country. And as we look at what we're considering, why do you think diversity training is under attack? That this executive order really kind of created a new wrinkle in what we've done I've been doing it for 30 years. How do you think that's impacting really as we look forward currently and maybe even in the future?
Well, I mean, I think, look, diversity training has always been under attack by some people. I mean, it's never been universally accepted. It's never been universally liked. And there were a lot of people who always thought that it was either indoctrination or touchy-feely bullshit or some such kind of a thing. And so it's not like it ever was not. I think you know, the reason it got amplified in this particular case were a couple of reasons it got amplified. One was clearly the listening in the Trump administration to these kinds of negative views of diversity is something that's not a hidden thing. I mean, I don't mean to get political about it, but it's just real. You know, that clearly the president doesn't like this kind of stuff, and therefore it's easier to influence him to do things like this. But I think that the other piece is it's not disconnected to the explosion of call for racial justice that we saw after the George Floyd lynching. And I think that, you know, seeing millions of Americans, even with COVID, being out in the street, and especially, you know, mixed race groups of people being out in the street, you know, all these corporations that jumped in, and, you know, people putting Black Lives Matter bumper stickers on their car, you know, it became sort of the cultural zeitgeist. And it's basic Newtonian physics, you know, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And so I think that as soon as something emerges that strongly, you're going to have the opposition again strike out more strongly. And I think that's what we saw here. I think in terms of how I'm sorry, go ahead, please, Juan.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, in terms of the second part of your question, in terms of how it will affect us, you know, thank goodness it will probably be eliminated as an issue as of January 21st, because the executive order will be voided. I think President-elect Biden has made it clear that he doesn't support the order, so that will be voided. But I think we will continue to find resistance out there, and I know that you know, some of you know I was attacked by some of these people myself, and you know, they have people who are training people through Twitter and various other sites how to resist diversity training, finding ways for people to make trouble in diversity trainings and all this. They're actually actively training people to do that. So it's something we have to anticipate and we have to get ready for and learn how to manage. But, you know, as Dr. King said, the measure of people is not how they perform at easy times, is how we perform in times of crisis. So if we're really committed, we just have to keep finding ways around the barriers that people put up to keep the conversation moving.
And I think you hit right on the point. We're coming to a different level of awareness and knowledge. And like my friend says, we're awoke now. And these different events that are going on around the country have really make us more awoke, but more aware of the opportunities. Do you see any barriers as we move forward as a diversity expert, especially your area of implicit or unconscious bias, that people often don't realize that everybody's got it and the impact that makes on our decision making? Well,
yeah, I mean, I think that's always an issue. And I think it's one of the issues that, you know, I always I always am somewhat not cynical, but a bit skeptical about declarations of wokeness because one of the real challenges we have, I think, when you do study bias, particularly unconscious bias, what we realize is that those of us who see ourselves as liberal or progressive are no more immune to it than anybody else, except that sometimes when you've identified yourself as a liberal or being on the right side of the question, you get even more defensive about looking at your own bias because that's not me who has that. It's only the bad people who have that. And I find often when I'm working with groups, that the most difficult groups sometimes to work with are the most liberal kinds of organizations because of that very thing. They'll tell you how they marched in the civil rights movement, how they did this and did that, but it's hard when you see yourself as somebody who's really deeply committed to this, to see it in yourself, to know it's in ourselves as well. And that's why I always share examples. Almost whenever I do a training or a workshop or anything, I almost always share an example of a blind spot that I saw in myself. Sometime when something showed up, it was like, where did that come from? Because I think everybody else has examples of that we know that occur. So I think that moving forward, I think one of the most important things that we need to do as practitioners is to always realize that we can't take people any farther than we've gone ourselves. And that means that we need to keep doing our own work because there are an awful lot of diversity practitioners who are coming from their own wounding. Something that's been incomplete. Now we're all motivated by our life experience, as I shared with you. I'm motivated by what happened to my family. But if every time I meet somebody who's German in a classroom, for example, I become a wounded, victim and treat that person as the oppressor, there's no way I can connect with them and reach with them. If I'm trying to heal my inner world by fixing them, it's just not going to work. So I think it's really important that as diversity practitioners that we're doing our own work and coming to a place of equanimity about whatever experiences we've had and our families have had so that we can be in a balanced place to work with the people we're working with.
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the head. And as our environment is still in a state of flux, what do you see on these as continued movement? Do we continue making forward progress as diversity experts? What can we do strategically moving forward as you look at this executive order?
Well, I think the executive order is clearly designed to have a chilling effect. I mean, it's an attempt at a modern day book burning. To say we can't have these conversations is obviously ridiculous. And eventually, I know that I just had an interview about 4 or 5 days ago with an attorney from the Legal Defense Fund, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. They're mounting a lawsuit, a First Amendment lawsuit against it. I know the ACLU is mounting a First Amendment lawsuit against it. So I have no doubt that eventually it'll be overturned because it's clearly an egregious overreach, First Amendment. I mean, the president may have the ability and the right to tell people within the federal government to not train somebody. That we may not like that, but it may be within the president's purview to do that, as the head of the government. But certainly requiring that corporations that contract with the government, saying that the president can determine what people train their own people in is a stretch to say the least. And several of the CEOs that I've talked to, all of whom support diversity, are nonetheless even more inflamed by the notion that, to quote one guy, this guy thinks he could tell me what I can train my people in. I don't think so, And I think that level of overreach is probably what'll have it be thrown out. But those court cases will probably be resolved, long after the inauguration. The woman from the LDF who I talked to was saying that they still plan on going through with it because they want to make sure there's no precedent. So I suspect these cases will go in play, will go on anyway, even though the actual impact of them will be moot. So, but beyond that, I think that we need to realize, anybody who's a quality practitioner and including all of you who are interested, know that education has always only been a small part of the work anyway. I mean, at best, I used to say to people that even the best training programs are like going to the gym and buying a gym membership and getting a workout program laid out for you, but you still need to go and work out. You still need to put stuff into action. And so I think when we look at all of the other things we could be doing, even as some of the education efforts are paused because of this, we can do coaching with senior leaders. We can begin to build some of these distinctions into leadership programs or team building programs. We can look at our structures and systems and continue to find ways that we can modify our structures and systems so that they're more bias resistant. We can find better ways to measure and hold people accountable in the organization to how we're performing relative to all these issues. I mean, I could go on and on, but there are so many different things that we could still be doing, even if we have to suspend training. And so I think that it's important that step back and assess where we are and figure out the next step forward. I studied chaos theory and systems theory, and one of the originators of systems theory was a guy named Ludwig Bertalanffy. And Bertalanffy created this concept he called equifinality, which basically means many roads to the same place. When you're working with a system, there's not only one path. And so if this path is blocked, we need to find the other paths to get there.
Very good. And that's one thing. I work in higher education. And when that order came out, the first thing we met was with our legal counsel, because we're still doing a lot of development. We don't train faculty, you develop them. That's a little different terminology, but, taking a different road to the same place. And that's part of it. Has this affected you as a professional in doing your sessions and your development sessions with professionals that might be tied in with the government? Have you seen any barriers on your side?
I have to say, I'm fortunate. It's had minimal effect on me in terms of any direct material impact on me. I mean, I had a couple of sessions that I was going to speak at government conferences. One I would be paid for. The other one was just sort of a minimal honorarium. Both of those were postponed. But the other side of it is that there's been a tremendous rush on the part of corporations, and that work has just continued to come in. And I'm also fortunate because I've been around a while, and so my name is somewhat recognizable. And so because of that reason too, I'm a bit immune to the brand attack, from the standpoint of this guy attacking me and telling lies about me on Laura Ingraham and Tucker Carlson and all. It's no fun to have, people on Laura Ingraham and Tucker Carlson shouting out your name and lying about you, because of course I got this huge flood of hate mail and actually more direct anti-Semitic stuff that I've experienced my entire 70 years up to now. I mean, some of it was pretty grotesque, including handwritten letters to my home. And so it was, I'm not going to pretend it was fun, but after a few weeks, the first few weeks were pretty unnerving. I'd wake up every morning and there was another right-wing website that had picked up the story. And then he did a Wall Street Journal op-ed and he did a New York Post op-ed. And there was part of me that wanted to run out and set the record straight, but I got good advice from many people, including my son, who's a PR person, who just said, if you do that, it just gives it oxygen. So you just have to let it go. And then the big turning point for me emotionally was the weekend that John Lewis and C.T. Vivian died. And I said to my wife, I said, as hard as this has been the last few weeks and as unpleasant as it's been, these people actually put their lives on the line for this cause. And I said, and all I'm doing is dealing with some people out there who I don't even know not liking me. It's like, so what? How big a deal? I'm not saying I enjoy it or anything like that, but at some point it's like, if you spend I've been doing this now for 54 years since I went to that first civil rights meeting, and you spend 54 years shaking the trees, occasionally a coconut's going to fall off and hit you on the head. It's just the way it is. So onward, as my dear friend Dr. Cole would say, onward. Yes. Yeah,
you hit it right on the point that we often stand on the shoulders of those that came before us that made a greater sacrifice, including champions like Representative Lewis that, was in the vineyards for many, many years up until he passed. And, that right. Strength gives us courage, knowledge, and wisdom to keep moving forward. And right now, I think we're at that cross point. How do we keep moving forward? Do you see anybody that is in your realm or coming up behind you is really going to promote this next level of inclusion and diversity and value?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there are so many young, brilliant practitioners out there. I mean, Tiffany Jana is somebody who I have a lot of admiration for. Mignon Tolan, who used to be with me at Cook Ross, who's now at Amnesty International, is a brilliant young practitioner. Brittany Harris, who works with Mary Francis, somebody who's really quite brilliant in what I could go on. There are just so many out there. And Rhodes Perry is somebody who I admire a lot for what he's doing. And there are just a ton of really great people out there who have grown up in an environment with a lot more freedom, actually, to explore these issues than some of us who are older had. And their work takes it to another level. And I'm tremendous admiration of them. I know people complain a lot about this millennial and Zoomer generations, but I'm the opposite. I think they're fabulous, and I think we saw that. I think we saw that in the way the Zoomers took over after Mr. Floyd was killed, and the role that they played in mobilizing and what they're doing now in organizations. So, it's time to let that generation stand up and step out.
And to step up and move up and stay up.
That's
and
right.
that's, that's part of the discussion that we have is diversity champions, diversity experts. We're constantly learning, constantly growing. Who do you see as your former role model or current role model, or kind of what do you see as your model moving forward beyond maybe this executive order?
Well, I mean, I'm really incredibly blessed to have had now for more than 15 years a close personal professional relationship with Dr. Janetta Cole, who I met when I spent a year as professor of diversity in residence at Bennett College for women. Dr. Cole, who I'm sure most of you know, is a former president of Bennett and Spelman, and also was former chair of the director of the African Art Museum in DC, and is now the current national chair of the National Council for Negro Women. She's 84 years old and has the energy of a 60-year-old. And she actually, when she left the African Art Museum, she came to work with me the last year and a half at Cook Ross. So we do a lot of work together, including actually the talk that this guy went after me for, that we did for the Treasury Department, which ironically, he cut her completely out of the story because I think he was too much of a coward to have his racism be so exposed or to go against NCNW. But she, those of you who know her know that she's a remarkable human being, not just for her intelligence and wisdom, but also because she may be the most gracious human being who's ever walked the planet. And so she's really my guiding light. And she, we talk 3-4 times a week, and she will sometimes, and she will often remind me that as tough as it seems, it was tougher. She grew up in Jacksonville, Florida area in the 1930s. So she knows what it was like. And for those of us who've been around a long time, I think this is one of the important things that we can do in coaching and sponsoring and supporting younger practitioners is to remind them of the historical timeline, and to remind them that as bad as it may seem, it was a lot worse. It is getting better. And that, as Dr. King said, the arc of the moral universe does bend towards justice. So, and that's important. It doesn't mean that we sit back on our laurels and we say, look what we did, but when you're climbing the ladder and all you see is how far you have to go, it's pretty intimidating. But when you remember how far you've come, it makes it a little bit less so. And I think that's really important for us. And Dr. Cole does that for me all the time.
Yeah, and I think that historical piece is critical, because you got to know where you came from to know where you're really going.
Absolutely.
And a lot, especially with our younger students, like me with my students, because they're going to teach multicultural education as professional teachers. So as you keep moving forward, what do you have any closing thoughts before we hit the Q&A? I know we want to give some time for Q&A and turn it over to Jewel.
No, I think it's really it's really a matter of like we said, you keep moving forward one step at a time. Keep looking where the opening is. Keep finding a door, the window that's open, so we can crawl in and do a little bit more, make a little bit more good trouble. And then if they close that one, find another one. If we have to come through the chimney, we'll do that. I mean, it's just all you have to do is keep moving forward. And Winston Churchill famously got up to do a college commencement speech after he retired, and he walks up to the lectern, and he looks out at the crowd. He says, "Never give up. Never, never, never give up. Thank you," and walked off the stage. I think that's what it comes down to: is we're in the right, we're doing the right work, and we're going to deal with resistance. I think Gandhi said, first they ridicule you, first they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they fight you, then you win.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And we'll all have battle scars and keep moving forward.
That's right.
So let's see what our questions come from our audience. I'm sure they're excited to ask questions from all of us. Jewel?
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for that. And so our first question comes from Lynn, and she wants to know, will you share your best advice for responding to, white men who think they're not part of the D&I space?
I'm resisting the snarky. I'm resisting the snarky thought which I had, which was smack them upside the head. But all kidding aside, I do think that we have to look often at the fact that we may inadvertently reinforce that message. So, in our language, for example, we often talk about people of color as diverse employees, as if diverse only means people of color, or we have a diversity committee for the organization an organization that's, let's say, 70% white has a diversity committee in which out of 25 people, there are 3 white people on it. And then we wonder why the diversity conversation seems to be isolated over there. You know, I can tell you just from the conversations I've had and all the people that I've been able to work with that there are lots and lots and lots of white men and women who are really committed to this work and who really want to make a difference. And we have to make sure that we're open to them joining the conversation and inviting them into the conversation. And the more people get into the conversation, of course, the more it will open up for other people to get into the conversation. And so we can't really do much. I mean, we could try to educate people, of course. We could try to give them the data and the facts and show how it's tied into the business and all that stuff. We should always do that. We always need to speak to that left brain, particularly in some organizations where people are really data and fact driven. But the thing that even if we can't reach people that way, the thing we can always do is we can look at ourselves. You know, how are we opening our hearts and minds to allow people to come in? And now I remember when I was teaching at Bennett, you know, my students, of course, were all young Black women. And at the end of my time there, they were really lovely. They put together this luncheon for me, and they were all telling me how much, acknowledging me and all this stuff. Was really sweet. And a number of them said, you know, you're the first white man I've ever trusted. And I said, look, I got to put an end to this. There are a lot of white men out there who would like to help you, who would like to support you, who would like to be your allies. And if you start with the conversation that they're probably not, then you may miss the opening that's there. So yes, you need to protect yourself. Need to make sure you're not, you don't walk into a buzzsaw. As Rumi, the poet Rumi said, trust in Allah, but tie up the camels. You still have to be careful, but don't shut down completely, because there may be people out there who would be willing to be allies.
Absolutely. My very first mentors in working in the federal government space were white men, because that's all that was there. And it's just approaching the 1 or 2 of them that you think will listen and will take you under your wing and sponsor you. But it's kind of meeting them where they are and finding that commonality at first, whether it was football. I'm a big football advocate. So sometimes that was my window in, just finding those common things and threads that you could talk about, just to pick up a small conversation that eventually led me into creating relationships with people that didn't look like me when I first started in the federal space. But so our second,
the other thing, Jewel, is that those of us who are white have to take on teaching our own people. I mean, it's like we have to do some of the work too. We got to reach out to people, from within our group. I'm not a believer that there's any one right person to do anything. I've been around long enough doing this for 35 years professionally, where there was a time when I started when I was like, what the hell are you doing up there? And then we went through a period, we've gone back and forth through periods where all of a sudden people said, oh, it's great to have a white man doing this, because then other white men were studying. And then we go back into, now there's a lot of people talking again saying, white people shouldn't do work race. And, my feeling is, somebody who's Jewish, I want everybody to be talking about anti-Semitism. I don't want just Jews to be talking about it. If I was, we know that the way we won, I was on the diversity advisory board for the Human Rights Campaign for 10 years. And while the campaign for marriage equality was there, and I'm heterosexual, and one of the things that they said was the reason they won that campaign was because of straight allies. I mean, that's not to say that people in the LGBTQ community didn't do a lot, but it was the addition, just like Dr. King after Selma called for white people to come out and support the march. I mean, we can't, and none of us can do this by ourselves. We all have to be engaging in this conversation. And unless we do, then it will always be a marginalized conversation.
Well, that's a great segue into the second comment from Karen that says, I think that during the last several months, the Black Lives Matters movement and protests, it demonstrated tremendous outpouring of all the nationalities wanting to heal, wanting to understand the differences. It showed areas that we should incorporate in our diversity training. How can we capture the growth of this period to advance diversity initiatives in America?
Thanks, Karen. I'm noticing, and I'm sure some of you are noticing, that there's an opening to talk about things now in organizations that there wasn't months ago. I mean, I'm doing a tremendous on systemic racism, on anti-racist leadership, on racial equity leadership. I'm talking to people about the 401 years and giving history lessons and things like that, that 6 months, 8 months, 10 months ago, people in organizations say, let's not make it only about race or this kind of a thing. You know, we're able to go into those places now. And so I think that's an extraordinary thing. And I think it's really, you know, we have to take advantage of that. That door may not stay open, because what will inevitably happen is other groups will start to say, all right, we got it already about the African-American experience. What about the Latinx experience? What about, you know, people with disabilities? What about, I mean, that's what happens. You know, we contract and we contract and we expand. Just like there was a lot of talk 2 years ago about the Me Too movement, and all of a sudden gender became a front and center conversation for a while, and now that's moved to the back again a bit. So that's just the nature of it. You know, we always have to be looking for where the opening is and go in through that opening and then expand from there. And I think that you know, the point that you're making, Karen, is a really excellent one. That, you know, riding on this energy and particularly creating coalitions. I mean, one of the things I get a little concerned about is that those of us who support diversity, I don't know whether we want to stay on the left or whatever we say that, I think we've all suffered because of how politicized this work has become. But I think we also have to be careful that we're not eating our own. You know, we get into our own, you know, arguments and disagreements about whether this kind of work is the right work or that kind of work is the right work. Or, you know, somebody posted the other day, I saw, if you're going in and talking to people about race in an organization, you've only got 2 or 3 hours, forget it. You know, you shouldn't be wasting your time. Well, you know, in theory, I get what they're saying, that it's a deeper conversation you can cover in 2 or 3 hours, but I can't even begin to tell you how many long-term clients who did deep work I had over the 3.5 decades that I've been doing this, that started as a 2-hour conversation. And after that 2-hour conversation, they were like, wow, this was interesting, let's do more. So I think we have to be careful not to have our foot nailed to the ground in terms of what's the only way to get to do it. And you find, you know, you take what the system gives you. Now, I'm not saying, by the way, I want to be really clear, I'm not saying that we don't have standards, and we each have to make those decisions on our own. You know, I've had companies call me. I had a gun company call me a few years ago, and they were giving me essentially a few $100,000 worth of business to do gender work in their organization. They weren't even talking to anybody else. Somebody had told me I was the person to talk to, and I had to say to them, look, I can't do the work with you because I'd be out of integrity taking your money to do work for you, and I hope you fail as a business. You know, and you know, they laughed and they said, it's not the first time we've heard that. You know, I obviously I did it a little bit more diplomatically than that, but the point is, some of my staff were pretty ticked off at me. You know, they said, you know, what are you doing? There's a lot of business, there's a lot of work, you know. And I said, I gotta wake up in the morning and look at myself in the mirror, you know. So I think we all have to be willing to draw that line wherever it's right for us.
Yeah, absolutely. The next one is from Kathy. She says, I have a good number of white male leaders now saying that they feel guilty for not understanding until now the microaggressions and systemic biases has had on their teams, and they want to do better, but they leave the office and go back to homogeneous environments and bubbles. To your point of we can't take people further than we have gone ourselves, how best can we encourage it? In the midst of a pandemic, no less, they diversify their own personal experiences too, i.e. the impact of microaggressions, systemic biases. Yes, starting the conversation is important, but even if it's imperfect, it's so critical.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more in terms of your last comment. It's starting the conversation is critical, and being in conversation with people. And being in conversation with people doesn't mean talking at them didactically. You know, one of the things that we know is that when people think you're trying to fix them, it triggers activity in the dorsal posterior insula of the brain, which is the same part of the brain associated with physical pain. And any of us who are in a relationship and tried to fix our partners know how well that works, right? So, but I think that, you know, just for clarification, I generally tend not to use the term microaggressions, and it's not because I don't agree in the concept, but the reason I still prefer to use the original terms of micro inequities and micro advantages is for 2 reasons. First is that it allows us to look at both the negatives and the positives that people get out of these circumstances, and sometimes it's the micro advantages that make a bigger impact than a microaggression or a micro inequity. So, for example, if I lean towards giving somebody an opportunity just because they look like me or they're the same group as me, that is to the detriment of somebody else, right? So, but the other reason is because the term aggression generally in language is used as a conscious thing. You don't usually think of people as being unconsciously aggressive, sometimes passively aggressive, but that's a different thing. So, and most of these behaviors we're talking about, people are unconscious about. I mean, they're mostly things that people don't do intentionally, that they don't even realize they're doing. Many of them are habitual. And so when you begin to talk about them as microaggressions, sometimes you bring up resistance that you don't need to bring up. But I think that this is a big piece of this is education. And what I say to people all the time is, I'm not really interested in your guilt. You know, your guilt doesn't do anything for me. What I'm interested in is you taking responsibility. So what are you going to do about it? Okay, so now you know that you're engaging in this behavior. We understand you didn't do it on purpose. We understand that 9 out of 10 times you didn't even know that you were doing it. That's all well and good, and it's important to know. But now what? Now what do? You know, how are you going to learn to avoid doing these things in the future? And you know, how do we shift that guilt to responsibility? Because, you know, sometimes people's guilt actually gives them an out. My oldest son, I love my oldest son dearly. He's a fabulous kid, and you know, he's a doctor now, and you know, but he's terrible at communicating. He'd be the first person to tell you that. And he's always, every time I talk to him, when he calls me back after waiting 3 days to return my call, he'll oh, I'm really sorry. I feel so bad, that I feel so guilty. And I finally said to Matt, I said, oh, I'm not interested in your guilt. Your guilt plus a quarter doesn't buy me a cup of coffee these days. You know, I said, you know, I said, either call back or don't call back, but don't burden me with your guilt about it. Because really, it's like, you know, not calling back plus feeling guilty for him was like calling back, you know. So, and I think it's the same thing, you know. Okay, fine, you feel guilty. That's nice. Now what?
Yeah. So Kathleen had a question. She said, hi, I may have missed something, Mr. Ross. Did you not take the gender work because it was out of your expertise?
No, we could very well have done that work. We did a lot of that work. When I say me, by the way, I mean the company. It wasn't just me. We did a lot of that work. We didn't do it because, you know, I tend to not support guns. I mean, I don't have mine. I'm out in the country here. I've got, you know, people who hunt around me, but this organization, the CEO was the largest contributor to the NRA. He was on the NRA board. He was somebody who has been outspoken against any kind of gun control. And, you know, he's entitled to his point of view. I don't mean to demonize him for it, but I couldn't justifiably do the work knowing that I didn't want his company to be successful. It just would have been out of integrity. And so I told him, find somebody who's more aligned with your beliefs so that, you know, you can get somebody who can really be committed to you. Money has never been the main objective for me in doing this work. You know, I mean, it's great. I want to take care of my family like everybody else. But I think we all have to make that. Just like there were times, you know, it's not so much now, but a number of years ago when we used to work in the Southern Crescent, you know, down in the Bible Belt, where, you know, people would call us in to do assessments, and they would say, you can't ask any questions about LGBTQ issues. You can't ask if it, and again, that was a no-brainer for me. I was like, well, then I can't. Then you got the wrong person doing the assessment, because I'm not going to ignore human beings who exist just because it makes somebody uncomfortable that they exist. So I think we have to all have our own standards and our own sense of integrity. And my experience, my life experience has been that when you take stands consistent with your integrity, the universe provides. It almost always happens. Anytime I've walked away from something because, you know, it was the right thing to do, something else popped up to fill the space. And maybe that sounds a little woo-woo, but I actually do believe that it's true. I believe that our integrity is what keeps us honest, it keeps us safe, and it keeps us successful.
Absolutely. So this one's from Farzin. Going back to your comment about allyship, I'm noticing that how we express allyship toward the Black community looks radically different than how we express allyship toward the Jewish or LGBT communities. For some reason, we feel that it's okay for allies to jump in or commandeer and co-opt Black culture and movements, whereas we don't for other communities. Even our allyship has an underlying anti-Blackness embedded in it, as if we don't trust the Black community to liberate themselves. For all other communities, we show up as if they need us too. But for the Black community, we show up how we want to. Thoughts on that?
Well, I think that that the point you make, Farzan, is an important point regarding allyship in general. I'm not sure that I agree it's only in the case of the Black community, but it's nonetheless problematic. I mean, certainly in the disability community, there are a lot of, in the community of disability activists, there are a lot of people who feel this way. In fact, they even have a motto about it called "Do it with me, not for me." I think that fundamentally, it especially shows up around Blackness around African Americans, because it's a continuation in a way of the narrative of racial difference that we've had in our society. And that is that white people are at the top of of whatever you want to call it, the pecking order or the social structure, whatever. And people of color below, and in most cases, African Americans at the bottom. And so that power differential often shows up for some people as, you know, I'm not against you, but I'm here to help you, without even realizing that they may be, or we may be, still a prisoner of some of those same patterns of bias, those same patterns of feeling better than, entitlement, privilege, and the like. I know that I watch myself all the time for that because I've been trained in this culture. I'm 70 years old. I grew up, you know, when I was a kid, I go to my father's store in Alexandria, Virginia, and there were still 2 water fountains there, and there were still 2 bathrooms there, you know, and that's in my own lifetime. So, you know, that's the world I grew up in. And even though I've worked on myself around this for 55 years, probably more than most people on the planet, it still sometimes is there. And I think it's really important that we have to learn that allyship really means standing side by side with people and amplifying people's voices, and sometimes stepping forward when it's appropriate, and sometimes stepping back and letting other people step forward. And I think there are times when all of them are valuable, and I think we have to have a broad range of ways to approach things. And so, as I said before, I think anytime we get sort of our foot nailed to the ground that there's only one right way to do it, we're in trouble. But you're absolutely right that it's we have to be careful that people don't co-opt people's experience and their ability to speak, especially, and be heard.
Absolutely. I think that was our last question or comment. So last call.
Thank you for that note, Kathleen. I appreciate that.
All right.
Okay.
So
well, look, it's great.
Thank you so much for this. This is awesome.
My pleasure. So great to be with all of you. I just wish you all a wonderful holiday season. I know this holiday season is going to be hard for all of us. It'll be the first time in 45 years that none of my children will be home for Thanksgiving. And I have to say that makes me sad, but I also know that they're safe, and that makes me really happy. So please stay safe and be well, and hopefully we'll see each other down the road soon. Thanks.